Okay, well, hey, thank you everyone for joining us today on the North Central U.S. Climate and Drought Summary and Outlook. We're going to have two speakers today. I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Doug Cluck. I work for NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, based out of Kansas City. And we're going to have two speakers today. This is our special, if you will, October end of the growing season call and webinar. Our first speaker is Laura Edwards. She's the South Dakota state climatologist, and she's going to run through a lot of the climate summary and outlook piece. And then we're going to have Brad Rippey from the USDA's Office of the Chief Economist sort of put in perspective the growing season in terms of climate impacts to this part of the country, the north central part of the country, and some of the issues that we saw. A lot of you are probably already familiar with a number of those, but this is kind of the end of the season, or close to the end of the season, where we start getting some information on how good or bad things actually turned out from an agricultural perspective. At the end, and this, since we're having two speakers and they have a lot to go through, we may run a little long today, which is okay on our part. But if you have to leave, we totally understand that at the top of the hour. So I'm going to hurry up and stop talking pretty quick here. But as we go through this, as you listen, feel free to type in questions in the question panel. That's part of the interface that you have. That's how we can get to your concerns and or questions that you may have during the show, so to speak. So at this point, I am going to turn it over to Laura, which I think your screen is already up and running. So take it away,
Laura.
That's right. Yeah, and I'll try to mute myself.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Doug. Yeah, we are going to race through this today. There's a lot to talk about here in October. And you can see this is a partnership of multiple individuals and agencies across the region that contribute content and information and make this webinar happen at the bottom of the screen there. First of all, you'd think this might be a spring kind of picture, but really this lilac in bloom had a second wind here in the fall, courtesy of Ray Wolf. He's in the Quad Cities. And I know that I've heard reports of other flowers and flowering trees and shrubs kind of coming back to life here in the fall with the very warm temperatures that we've had, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail. First of all, here, just to reiterate the handful of partners and NOAA agencies that contribute content to this. And at the top are two links there. If you end up missing part of the webinar today or want to go back and see old ones, they're both at the Midwest Regional Climate Center and High Plains Regional Climate Center. They will be archived there. Our next webinar is November 18th, same bat time at same bat channel at 1 p.m. Central. So stay tuned again for our next update in November. So our agenda for today, very similar to what we've done in the past, recent conditions. We'll talk about kind of recent climate conditions, then get into some impacts, which there are plenty of this month, and then the outlooks. And also coincidentally today, NOAA released their winter season outlook. So we'll not just look at the coming 3 months, but we'll take a peek ahead towards the winter a little deeper, given the NOAA release today. And here's a picture of a perfect fall day. I know we've seen a lot of these across the region here in October from Pete Boulay in Minnesota. A real beautiful picture of the Mississippi River out in Wabasha. September temperature starting here just for the month of September. I know these webinars kind of fall in the middle of the month, but as far as the full month data, this is the most recent information we have from NOAA as they update this monthly. How did September rank, historically speaking? Out of 127 years of history, much of the region were 100th to 120th or so on the warm side, with Colorado leading the pack at 125th or third warmest in the period of record. Out east, a little bit cooler, more like the 27th or 28th warmest on record out of 127 years, but by all accounts, warmer than average in the month of September. Look at the growing season overall, and this is just kind of overlap with Brad Rippey, what he'll present later on the agriculture impacts for the season. You know, really very warm in Minnesota, Wyoming, Minnesota having the 4th warmest growing season on record. And by growing season, I'm looking at April through September. Similar with Wyoming, 123rd warmest or 4th warmest. So really quite a lot of that is due to some other very warm temperatures. If you remember early summer, we had several 100-degree days or 90+ degree days, even in the northern states. And that certainly played a role in the drought situation that we had over the growing season. Looking at precipitation just for the month of September, kind of some wet and dry areas and some areas in between. Green states are colored, and you can see the scale at the bottom. The lighter green, say in South Dakota, is the top 3rd warmest, with Montana coming in on the driest 10th percentile of their historical records. So the beiges and browns are in the drier side, and the gray colors are near normal, kind of the middle 3rd of historical ranking. So nothing really great for September in many of the states, at least nothing really unusual in the gray colored states, but really a mixed bag. And we see that kind of playing out in the drought progression over the last month, which we'll show in a little bit. Growing season precipitation, again, looking at April through September overall, that 6-month period. How did each state rank over the 127-year period? We saw Montana 5th driest, Minnesota 9th driest, North Dakota 12th driest. And those are areas that were among the hardest hit in the drought in our region anyway, in the north central region, with several areas of D3 to D4 level drought on the Drought Monitor at some point this season. Looking further south in the region, Kansas, Missouri, and into Illinois and Wisconsin, more middle of the pack as far as precipitation, total precipitation for the 6-month period. So not to say there wasn't anything worth noting. Certainly there are lots of ups and downs in the season. All right, so I'm looking at some data here. The next several maps will look just at the last 30 days. So pretty much since our last webinar in September. So this kind of does capture the first part of October so far. No question, the big story lately has been the very warm temperatures that we've seen all across the region. And that's what's shown here on this map from the Midwest Regional Climate Center, where anything in the oranges, browns are above average. You can see the scale at the bottom, so you can kind of pick your favorite location or your backyard. When you get into the pink colors, that's pushing 10 to 12 degrees above average for the last 30 days. So we see parts of that in North Dakota and northern Minnesota. The few areas that have been cooler than average over the last 30 days include parts of western Colorado, southern Wyoming, and that area. So by all accounts, warmth is the story, and we're seeing much more of this. We're seeing in both the maximums and the minimum temperatures. Maximum temperatures on the left, minimum temperatures on the right, looking at how different they are from the average for the last 30 days. These are titled Departure from Mean, telling us how different they are from average. And really you see warmth in both the minimum and maximum temperatures essentially all across the region, with the exception again of that western Colorado area that was slightly cooler on the maximum temperatures. And just to put this in perspective, I'll be talking about frost temperatures a little bit later because we're in that season as well, but preliminary data for October so far, just looking at minimum temperatures, over this last week, I heard several comments, especially from the Eastern Corn Belt, on how just exceptionally warm it has been. And, according to the preliminary data here from the Iowa Mesonet website, number one is hottest out of 129 years of record that they have. So you see a lot of very warm, and this is average low temperatures, average minimum temperatures by climate divisions. So anything one is currently ranking top of the heap for minimum temperatures for October. Looking at the precipitation side, we see a little more variability here, where we've got some dry spots and wet spots across the region. And this again is over the last 30 days. You see the wetter areas there over Dakotas, Wyoming, and then the east side over in Indiana, Ohio, and southern Michigan that are pushing above average, where we see dryness more prevailing in the middle, Minnesota, Wisconsin, into Iowa, and south into Nebraska, northern Missouri, tending more on the dry side more than anything. And then also eastern Colorado, where we've seen some degradation in drought conditions there, or expansion of drought conditions in eastern Colorado. So really a variable precipitation pattern here over the region. And again, using the data from the Iowa Mesonet website, looking at some preliminary rankings for precipitation for the month so far, it really has been quite wet in the Dakotas in particular, where you see North Dakota, some climate divisions ranking 4th wettest out of their 129-year record on this website. Even parts of South Dakota and Montana are right up there with 5th, 6th, 7th, top 10 essentially wettest October so far. Similar, we see some areas in Illinois, Indiana that are also looking at top 10 wettest starts to October, at least for start of October. This is also getting reflected in soil moisture. This is the percentile ranking as we see today from Climate Prediction Center. Certainly the green areas in the Dakotas and part of the eastern Corn Belt into Michigan are showing or reflecting some of that recent rain, where we see drier than average soils over much of Montana, eastern Wyoming, Colorado, and then through up into Iowa and Minnesota. So very closely reflecting precipitation patterns that we've just seen over the last 30 days. Again, these are over areas that had experienced drought much of this year in the north central states. So it appears that soils are responding very rapidly either to drying or wetting conditions over the last month or so. And to finally show the U.S. Drought Monitor, at least for our region, for the central region that we include in this webinar primarily, a big gradient with very exceptional and extreme drought up in the northwest in Montana, in that part of our region, all the way down to no dryness noted in the southeast part of our region, Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, for the most part. So we are seeing quite a range of drought conditions over the region. And this is the map that's updated every Thursday morning. So this is from today. Overall, about just under half of the region is in some level of drought, about 48% in some level of drought. Again, focusing mostly, as you can see, on the western and northern part of the region. To kind of put this into perspective, if you don't remember what we showed a month ago, here we are for the last 4 weeks. What has been the net change of drought monitor classifications over that time? So this is showing how many classes of change there have been according to the U.S. Drought Monitor in 4 weeks. If you look over the scale on the right there, oranges, yellows show degradation or worsening. Green colors show improvements, and then the gray color shows no net change over that time. So as we've been talking about, following very similar to the soil moisture and precipitation patterns, where Montana, parts of Wyoming and eastern Colorado, and then up into Iowa and Wisconsin has seen some levels of degradation from 1 to 2 categories, with improvements across much of the eastern Corn Belt and then up in the Dakotas and eastern Minnesota, where we see as much as 3 categories of improvement just over that 4-week period. So recent rains have really substantially improved drought conditions. I'd say me living up in that northeastern South Dakota part of the country, certainly it has turned very wet here, and I believe those category changes are justified. So looking at climate impacts, just over the region, we're seeing some beautiful sunrises and sunsets. I've seen lots of pictures of beautiful skies across the region this fall. You know, hunting season is starting to go across much of the region, and there on the bottom right is the Missouri River as I crossed it about a week and a half ago on a very windy day at Fort Thompson at the intersection of Crow Creek and Lower Brule reservations at Big Bend Dam. So on the right would be eastern side of the river from that perspective. So it's been very dry fall for some folks and wet for some others there. Looking at freeze dates, we have been talking about this. I think we, being climatologists, gardeners, farmers, about how late the freeze has been this year, how late we've seen frost temperatures. And so this is a map from the Midwest Regional Climate Center, their VIP product, looking at the date of the first 32-degree freeze. I'll show 28 degrees here in a minute. And this data is through this morning. This map is updated this morning. So you can see the green colors, the very bright light green are ones just this morning, October 21st to 31st. That's the last third of the month. Much of the northwest, say the Dakotas, Nebraska, parts of Kansas, Colorado, some Minnesota, saw most of their first frost in that middle third of October, and I think a lot of that was just maybe last week. But we've been frost-free for much of the central and eastern part of our region, still to this day. To kind of put it in perspective, here's the climatological date of our first 32-degree freeze. So this is the median date of our first frost. So you can see we're up in the northern states, north central states, we're running, you know, easily 1 to 2 weeks or more behind the median frost date just for 32 degrees. As we're looking at, you know, more of the southern states, say Illinois, Indiana, we're getting on the later side now, where there may be days to about a week or so behind their average frost date, but looks like we're not going to see a very cold pattern set up in the near future. So we're having quite a bit of bonus time, I'll say, to the growing season this year, or the frost-free season. Next, put you know, 28-degree frost is what some people call a killing frost, and we've seen some areas just reach that this morning again, looking at the Dakotas around that region. We did see some earlier out west in the higher elevations in plains of Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado. But again, this is much later than usual for a hard frost, where I know we're expecting some temperatures to continue in the lows in the 20s, low 30s in the next couple of days here in the Dakotas at least. But still, this is later than average. Typically, we see a hard frost before now in the northern states. We look in southern more into, you know, late October, early November when we look at Kansas, Missouri, southern Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. Tend to see that more in the latter third of October, early November. So not quite there yet for the southern part of the region, but northern part of the region, we are starting to run later than average for the 28-degree killing frost. One other kind of climate impact I wanted to share, a couple here that kind of seem to not follow, but Brad will talk about all the agriculture stuff here in a minute. West Nile virus, which is carried by a vector, carried by a mosquito. Often peaks in late summer, early fall, and so around August or so around here. And we kind of have season-ending numbers now that we're starting to see frost temperatures that will start to kill the mosquitoes and several other insects that we've all been pestered by. But looking at the map on the left, that's 2021 compared to 2020 on the right, much higher incidence of West Nile virus per 100,000 people in North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Colorado, higher than last year. It seems like much of the rest of the states are kind of similar. When we look at Iowa and Kansas, Missouri, and eastward, but certainly is something to take note of. We do often see a higher incidence rate of West Nile virus in drought years, ironically, than we do in wet years. Another thing to note here, Missouri River, the graph on the right showing total system storage in all the reservoirs, all the major reservoirs on the river. So the 2021 line is where we are now, and you can see we're dipped much lower than average, which is the middle bars here. You can see indicative of average from 69 to 2020. Couple lines to note, 2019 and 2011, two other previous flood years, to kind of put that in perspective. It didn't take us long here. It only took us 2 years to get from that very high record year in 2019 to where we are in 2021. Also in 2019, September of that year, we had quite a bit of runoff in the eastern Dakotas and a very wet September that year as well. So they had a much prolonged season for high flows on the Missouri River. Current system storage is about just over 50 million acre feet as of their early October report. Their runoff forecast for the calendar year, for 2021 calendar year, 57% of average, or about 14.8 million acre feet. They do have some public meetings planned for next week, where I understand they are doing kind of a tour of the basin at their usual stops. So look on their website for more information on that for next week if you're interested in attending one of their public meetings. Great Lakes, another water area of interest here. A couple things to show. First, on the left, I just took a sample here, Lake Michigan and Huron water levels from Harbor Beach, Michigan. The data here, the blue, and this is for the calendar year so far. So you see the months on the bottom on the x-axis. The green lines are the monthly means for water levels. So we are seeing above average water levels still this year. A lot of the lakes are, not all of them. Some are closer towards average, but that's where we're seeing for water levels. Along with that, again, most of the Great Lakes, not all, are seeing above average water temperature. This graph on the right is showing Lake Superior, which is kind of the exception. It's been continuously warmer than average for much of this year, so I kind of chose this one as an outlier. The reason why we're kind of looking at Great Lakes information right now is because we've been so warm for this season so far. There's a potential when we turn cold, an increased potential perhaps for some lake effect driven snow. So when you have that very warm water with very cold air coming across it, you can generate some more enhanced lake effect snow. So that's one potential impact we could see going forward here later in this year. One other kind of unusual thing that has happened in October is the amount of severe weather, especially in South Dakota and Minnesota, with 15 tornado warnings issued for the Aberdeen office warning area. So that includes central, northeastern South Dakota, and west central Minnesota. They issued 14 tornado warnings last week between October 9th and 13th. They actually had 14 tornadoes reported, so that's the second highest number of tornadoes in October. And between those two days, 7 in South Dakota and 7 in Minnesota. In all previous Octobers in South Dakota, there's only been 18 tornadoes and 29 in Minnesota, at least in their records, with 96 being the single largest outbreak with 24 total on that single day. So you can see on the graphic here, they've issued the most tornado warnings in October that as they have record of back to 86. A number more similar to June or July, which is actually very quiet severe weather-wise, and I believe that's been mentioned on this webinar in the past for this season, how quiet it's been severe weather-wise in general across the region. All right, so some highlights. I'm trying to talk fast here. We have a very late frost. We've got a lot of mosquitoes, ticks, grasshoppers, midges all still active. We're seeing some areas with near record growing degree days this year, partly due to the extended growing season, partly due to the very warm temperatures as well. We've had some dry conditions, and then some wet and warm just recently has allowed some new growth in gardens, kind of reinvigorating beans, tomatoes, those kinds of things in the gardens. We've had pretty good fall harvest progress, and Brad will mention that a little further, with the exception of some very wet conditions in the Dakotas, where we have some areas now, including Watertown, South Dakota, now the second wettest October so far, with still about 9 days to go, 10 days to go. The reblooming of some flowering vegetation, as I mentioned, the lilacs earlier, and other impacts in wildlife in drought in South Dakota has led to some buyback of some deer licenses due to epizootic hemorrhagic disease in western South Dakota. That's been very, very impactful to the whitetail deer population in particular. So there have been some drought impacts that are just playing out here still in the fall season. Also, I didn't talk about fire much, but there has been some grass fire activity in Kansas in particular, and some other local areas of hay bale and harvest fires, as I've seen in South Dakota, and I know some elsewhere, before we turned wet the last couple of weeks. So I'm going to jump on ahead to the climate outlooks. And I know I'm running kind of short on time here, but we'll look at La Niña for first to start off with that outlook, and then kind of step out starting in the near term, 7 to 10 to 14 day outlook, and then through the winter season. So first, La Niña a La Niña advisory is in place now, according to NOAA's Climate Prediction Center. 87% chance of continuing through the winter or into the winter. This would be the second La Niña winter in a row. So when I was pulling these slides together, I had a lot of similar information as last year, it kind of seems. So I tried to change it up a little bit here for you. As second La Niña winter in a row is not super common, but not too unusual either. This year compared to last year seems to be more coordinated response with the atmosphere and the ocean out in the Pacific Ocean. So that seems to give a little more confidence to La Niña outlook. Seems to be a little slower ramp up as far as sea surface temperatures go versus last year. But we have met the criteria for NOAA to declare, I guess, La Niña advisory. And on the right here is an image of kind of the typical wintertime pattern that we can see with La Niña. Primarily up in the north central states, we see more of a cooler late winter in particular. Doesn't show a lot on precipitation, except for the northwest part of the country shows wet and cool, tends to be a little bit wetter. But we'll see what NOAA advised here in the outlook here. And to recap, wintertime temperatures, they're looking at the peak strength, a moderate strength event for La Niña this year. So I kind of drew some red boxes around the moderate years, at least historically, of La Niña. This is looking just at temperature. So you can see in the north central states, we at least historically have seen many cool winters that way. But again, La Niña is really a fickle thing, not very consistent year to year, or event to event, I should say, for La Niña. Here's the precipitation, at least historically, looking at moderate strength events again in the red boxes. You see not too much. Some areas that don't show much difference from average precipitation, some may be slightly wetter, some slightly drier. So not really consistent again, and not a lot to hang our hat on necessarily for La Nina, but it is, if anything, one of our best indicators for winter. So looking out the next 7 days, precipitation, there's been a lot of talk about California and the Pacific Northwest. They are just going to get hammered over the next week. But looking here more locally, looking at northern Missouri, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, looks like the wettest part of our region in the coming week with the best chances of precipitation. Purple showing 1.5 to 3 inches or more of total precipitation over the next 7 days, at least according to this one forecast product. After that, looking out 8 to 14 days, we see odds leaning towards warmer than average across all the central states, and higher chances even more in the Great Lakes region. So looks like warmer temperatures will return to the region in 8 to 14 days time. And along with that, looking on the right, drier than average conditions also is the leaning towards below average precipitation, slightly leaning anyway, towards the central and southern part of our region here. For November overall, this is the new update that was released this morning. And you can see the north central states, Montana, Dakotas, Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, primarily equal chances of warmer, cooler, or near average temperatures for the month of November, where much of the southern and Great Lakes region is more favored to be warmer than average. On the right, precipitation, you see kind of a typical La Nina pattern starting to set up here, with the Northwest states, northern Rockies favoring above average precipitation, and over the Great Lakes, where southern part of, say, Colorado, Kansas, Missouri, odds leaning towards drier than average. So we're starting to see a hint of La Nina come out in these outlooks starting in November. Stepping out to November through January, all those 3 months kind of put together, again, a very similar pattern with the north central states not particularly leaning towards warmer or cooler, and no clear consensus in the models either. So warmer than average is still favored over the central southern part of our region over the Great Lakes. Precipitation, again, very similar to the November outlook by itself. The 3 months of November, December, January show above, odds leaning towards wetter than average in the Northwest and Great Lakes region. We're in between equal chances of wetter, drier, or near average for precipitation. This tells us, again, there's not a lot of consensus in the models here, especially over the Dakotas and Minnesota, in either temperature or precipitation, and could lead to a lot of variability within the season, maybe, and we'll see how that plays out. Just because the winter outlook was released today, looking out a little further ahead towards January, February, and March, that 3-month period put together, this is what that outlook shows. And here you see more of that La Nina signal with the colder than average temperatures potentially there in Montana, Dakotas, northern Wyoming on the left, with the remainder of the south and eastern part of our region still leaning towards warmer. And then on the right there, precipitation, again, not telling us a lot for the Dakotas and Nebraska, but either side, east and west, looking towards wetter, potentially in that late winter, early spring season. So some key messages here. We've seen some drought recovery. This is for the webinar, for my presentation overall. Seen some worsening in Colorado, but mixed elsewhere. We have a much prolonged frost-free season with some near record warm temperatures for minimums. We see a lot of impacts in farms, gardens, insects that I've tried to explain here. We do see drought lingering across the region, and as especially in the north central states there, Dakotas, Minnesota, parts of Montana, generally limited improvement in the cold season, which is the dry season up for much of that region. In addition to just being cold when soils freeze, they don't recover moisture as well. Both the Missouri River and, Missouri River water levels below average for this time of year. Great Lakes, not so much. Sorry, that's a misspoke there. And then La Niña, of course, is kind of the biggest player as far as our indicators for winter season climate. With that, I do have some quick contact information here, which you can also see in the recording as well. Doug and Dennis are on the call, and Brad Rippey's on the call, and he'll give the agriculture summary here next. So sorry to go long, Brad, Doug.
All right, Doug, I'll go ahead and take it over here unless you have any comments in between. This is Brad Rippey from U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Yeah, let's, there we go. I was going to say, let's make sure our screen or slides are up there. There you go. That looks like a full screen to me. So, yep, go ahead, Brad.
Good.
Thank you.
All right, I'll carry right on and try to take 15 to 20 minutes here, go through some of the agricultural highlights of the 2021 growing season across the Midwest and Great Plains. With the pandemic, I haven't been able to travel to the Midwest for a couple of years, so you're gonna have to settle for an opening shot of hail-damaged corn from Virginia. But that severe weather outbreak did originate in some of our Midwestern states, so we'll count that. Unlike 2020, when we had the derecho event of August that hit Iowa and really a huge swath of the Midwest, despite what Laura said about some of this October tornadic activity, we did make it through relatively unscathed. One of the biggest severe weather events that we had in the Midwest was a late July severe weather outbreak, a hail swath a couple 100 miles plus long. But again, nothing like what we saw in 2020 in terms of severe weather. Looking at some of the highlights for 2021, drought was a huge part of the landscape in some of our northern and western production areas as you move into the Dakotas, Montana, Wyoming, for example. But most of the eastern Great Plains and the Midwest actually had a pretty good growing season. As a result, we are, as of October 1st, data from USDA, National Agricultural Statistics Service, indicating it will be a #2 year all time for US corn and soybean yield. More about that shortly. We did have a quick and productive planting season in many areas, allowing crops to get a good early start. And then except for the drought areas in the north and west, we had relatively little heat stress, not a whole lot of days where we reached that 95-degree plus threshold in the central and eastern part of the Corn Belt. So unless you were in, say, Bismarck, North Dakota, or other parts of the Dakotas, Montana, where we actually approached record number of days of 95 and 100-degree heat and did break some records, it was a pretty easy summer in terms of high temperatures. But that said, we did have a lot of humidity and warmth at night, as showed by Laura and in previous webinars. And that did factor into the picture a little bit in the form of increased disease pressure. We did see tar spot being a big factor in Illinois, and I know there were reports of tar spot and other humidity and warmth-related diseases in other parts of the central and eastern Corn Belt, resulting in stalk weakening. And that has kind of changed the way harvest has gone about this fall. And again, I'll talk about more of that in a few slides ahead. Now, hay production due to the drought was significantly curtailed in those hard-hit areas. And I wouldn't say leading, it's probably not the best word there, but certainly contributing to feed price increases in an environment of overall inflation over the last year. And then concerns looking forward for producers include lingering drought impacts. For example, it's going to take until at least spring before we see significant pasture and rangeland recovery in the hardest hit areas. And another problem facing producers this fall is fertilizer prices and availability. So it's always something, but that's kind of what we're looking at now heading into the autumn months. and looking ahead to next year. Now, just looking at some of the latest vegetation health information from satellite-based data here, we are seeing still drought-related impacts quite apparent across the northern high plains into the western United States. And most of that is showing up in terms of the rangeland and pasture stress. So the grasslands still looking very bleak in Montana, the western Dakotas, into Wyoming, parts of Colorado in particular. You can see that little drought stripe that runs across southern Wisconsin, northern Illinois, and into Iowa. That's definitely a drought impact, but some of those redder and browner colors in the Midwest are actually not due to crop stress. It's because of the accelerated development of crops, as well as the early harvest. So you have brown or barren fields at a time when things would still ordinarily be a bit greener. So you just see that showing up as stress, but it's really just advanced development and early harvest in parts of the Midwest. Latest drought monitor out this morning shows 46% of the country experiencing drought. For the continental United States as a whole, that is the 56th consecutive week we have seen 40% or greater drought coverage. That is the third longest streak in the history of the Drought Monitor, going back to the turn of the 21st century. The only longer streaks, 2002 and 3 and 2012-13, to see that 40% plus US drought coverage. Looking at some of the subjective topsoil moisture numbers from US Department of Agriculture's National Agricultural Statistics Service, you can continue to see, even with some of that autumn rainfall, we are still seeing relatively dry soil moisture or soil conditions as you move into the Great Plains and points westward. Of note, Montana has been running #1 in terms of topsoil moisture rated very short to short for a number of weeks, currently standing at 94%. The numbers in brackets are a comparison to the same time a year ago. You can actually see from the Dakotas southward into Kansas, and even in parts of the western and southern Corn Belt, things are actually more moist than they were this time a year ago as we slipped into this drought of 2020-21. So certainly some changes from last year. Overarching dryness is still a concern, especially in the West. Nationally, 37% topsoil moisture, very short to short, compared to 56% this time a year ago nationally. Now, if you show that in graphical format, you can see that we're actually now in better shape, as I mentioned, 37% versus last year's 56%. Earlier this year, though, we did peak above 50% for several weeks back in late summer, and we hit 50% again in early autumn. So you do note that improving tendency, and a lot of that has been some of those autumn rains that Laura talked about in various parts of the Midwest and the Northern Plains. Some of the states that have seen recovery in recent weeks, really notable across Minnesota, which had over 80% topsoil moisture very short to short in the upper right just a few weeks ago, and that has improved to 20% very short to short, dramatic improvement there. Lesser improvements noted in other upper Midwestern states, the Dakotas and Iowa, for example. On the flip side, Laura talked about some of that heavier rain that we've seen in the last 30 days or so in parts of the lower Great Lakes region and the eastern part of the Corn Belt into the Ohio Valley. That's left topsoil is pretty moist, for example, in Michigan at 62% surplus and more than 20% to around a third surplus in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. Now, 2 years ago, it was all about flooding. 2019, Risk Management Agency of U.S. Department of Agriculture, crop indemnities. This largely showed in 2019 areas that were unable to plant due to wetness. You might remember that even into the spring of 2020, we still had some areas in the eastern Dakotas that were still too wet to plant. So I just left those slides in from last year just to show the context and comparison. 2021 was all about drought, and you can focus in on Montana and the Dakotas, northwestern Minnesota. Significant crop indemnities, that was all drought related. There's a little patch of color in northern and central Missouri. That may have been due to some of the flooding back in May and June. but regardless, the big focus on this is the high amount of crop indemnity damage payouts there across the northern plains and extending southward through parts of the Great Plains. You see eastern Colorado, western Kansas showing up there, as well as parts of western Nebraska and Wyoming. I'm going to step through our first corn and soybeans, two big crops for the Midwest. These graphs you'll see repeated. I'll explain it just once. Dark green is major production areas at 75% of the US production. Light green is 24%. So the two green shadings account for 99% of the US production areas. The numbers within the state are the percentage contribution based on 2017 agriculture census data. So for example, Iowa, your number one producer for corn, 17% of the annual production. All right, that said, I'll step through and take a look. You can see it was pretty much a trend line year for corn. We weren't quite at a record level, but very close. These are not final numbers. They are subject to change over the next few months as harvest continues and the final numbers are tallied. We are looking at some potential corn yield records for 2021. Given the nature of the trend line, records are not unusual from year to year when conditions are favorable. That said, we are expecting potential corn yield records in 2021 for Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, and Michigan, those central and eastern corn belt states that were kind of the garden spot for this growing season. Corn production also close to a record with that 15 billion bushels expected in 2021. Now, corn conditions, this is the last report of the season, October 17th. Good to excellent rating finished at 60% for the nation. That's 1 point below our final point last year, 61% good to excellent. But you can see the better numbers in our southern and eastern states were partially offset by the terrible numbers in Minnesota and North Dakota and South Dakota. The very poor to poor ratings, it was a bit of a horse race all year, ended up North Dakota, unfortunately, on top. 46% of the corn rated very poor to poor, close behind South Dakota at 42%. And then coming in third and fourth, respectively, distant third, Colorado, just over a quarter of the crop, very poor to poor, and Minnesota came in with 25%, very poor to poor. As of October 17th, the corn harvest has been progressing very well. In spite of some of those recent heavy rains in the upper Midwest, things got off to such a quick start, a drought accelerated crop. Of course, that came at the expense of yield potential, but already more than half of the corn harvested in South Dakota by the 17th of October, more than half in Minnesota. You can see in brackets compared to the 5-year average pace. Only in the eastern, far eastern part of the region do we see at or behind average progress, and that's been slowed a bit by some of the recent rainfall there. So overall, a quick corn harvest, producers going after some of that diseased corn with the weaker stalks, tar spot being one of those diseases. So producers going after corn, which often sits in the field much longer than soybeans, which are regarded as more fragile traditionally. So, you know, Illinois is still ahead of normal pace, but producers are trying to get that out ahead of the soybeans this year, a bit unusual. Now going to the soybeans, here's your production areas, very similar to the corn, except that some of the growing areas extend into the south more so. And looking at the soybean yield, again, very close to a record. Going back a few years, we saw a bit higher at 51.9. For the 6 states, or yeah, for the states that had corn records are also expecting soybean records. Those states being Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky. We're also expecting record yields for soybeans in Nebraska and Iowa. So despite some drought, some of the late summer rains appear to have helped the soybean crop in those last 2 states, Nebraska and Iowa, pushing them to potential record soybean yields this year. Soybean production, if realized, would just barely be an all-time record this year. Soybean condition, last report of the season was a week ago, showing good to excellent ratings, 59% nationally. That's 4 points below where we ended up last year. Again, the Dakotas and Minnesota dragging down those national numbers a bit. Soybean condition on the flip side, very poor to poor ratings. North Dakota easily won that one, 47% of the crop, very poor to poor. Other states above 1/4, very poor to poor, South Dakota and Minnesota. Soybean harvest progress, again, so much early maturation and harvesting before the heavy rains hit. Minnesota has been the #1 state in terms of soybean harvest progress nationally for a number of weeks now, almost finished at 91% by the 17th. South Dakota is right behind at 86. Things might slow down a little bit now with the wetter conditions moving in, but still overall an extremely quick harvest in the upper Midwest. You can see in Illinois, producers going after the corn, the fragile corn before the soybeans. That's why we're seeing some of those harvest delays, for example, in Illinois, along with some of the recent rain in the eastern corn belt. I do want to point out a few other crops and really focus in on some of the drought affected crops. I'll take a minute to go through this. Spring wheat harvest finished up very early. It was almost complete by early September, almost unheard of for such an early harvest. But that's because the US yield was just 32.6 bushels per acre, lowest since 2002. The Durham wheat, a pretty small crop compared to spring wheat, but a absolutely abysmal 24.3 bushels per acre. That's going to be the lowest since the drought of '88, if that number is realized. Truly incredible in this era of increasing yields and better techniques, better seed. So truly a disaster for the Durham wheat crop. Barley was also hit by the drought across the Northwest. Sunflower production, almost all of it in the Dakotas in the United States, expected to be down more than 1/3 from last year. Although in fairness, that's only 13% on the yield decrease and a 27% decrease in harvested area, lowest since '89. And one crop that did survive the drought, sugar beets, mostly grown in the Red River Valley of the eastern Dakotas and western Minnesota. Now, the harvest of that crop has been delayed by the autumn warmth because the beets are piled in the field. You can't pile them when it's too warm. And now we've seen some rain too also since the warmth has ended. Now, the production estimate for sugar beets, though, is expected to be up from 2020 several percent, in part to the extended growing season that allowed more sugar to accumulate in the beets. Sorghum production, mostly to the south. A lot of the sorghum production comes out of Kansas. Production up 26% from last year, but the yield is actually down. We just had a big increase in harvested area. Winter wheat, we have two crops to talk about, and I'll briefly mention last year's crop. The newly planted crop is starting to emerge, but we have seen some issues in some areas due to lingering dryness and drought with slow planting and slow emergence. Finally, rangeland and pastures remain in terrible shape in the drought areas of the Dakotas, points west from there. Nationally, all hay yield down almost 4% from 2020 and production down 5%. Going through these crops quickly, you can again see production areas. This is a focus on some of those drought hit areas. Spring wheat, a lot of it comes from North Dakota. It's going to be, again, that lowest crop since 2002 if that low yield is realized. So you can see about every 5 years, we're good for a pretty significant drought across the northern plains. 2002, 2006, 2011, 2017. But wow, 2021 really jumps out with that low yield compared to previous years. Looking at the comparison between this year and last year by state, hardest hit state was Montana, a decline of 55% from last year, just 17 bushels per acre. Nationally down 33% from last year. Durham wheat, almost all of it comes from northeastern Montana and western North Dakota nationally. There's your lowest since '88 when we only realized 15.7 bushels per acre. We're getting to the point where only a few of us were working back in the late '80s and really professionally remember that drought. So it's really historic to see the worst in 33 years. Durham wheat down 59% from last year in Montana to just 16 bushels per acre. Sunflowers, Hurt by the drought, most of the sunflowers, commercial sunflowers, come from the Dakotas. Harvest progress is underway, seeing a few slowdowns due to some of the recent wetness, but overall above average harvest progress for sunflowers, except in North Dakota. And for sugar beets, again, a crop that has survived the drought, over half of the national acreage is in the Red River Valley and adjacent areas. Very slow harvest due to that autumn warmth. Can't pile the beets because they will decay, so you have to wait until it cools down, hence the slow harvest in North Dakota and Minnesota. There's your sugar beet planting progress compared to previous years, including the 2019 Mudfest that we're kind of running parallel to. Completely different reason for the slowdown this year. Sorghum, mostly grown in Kansas, and you can see that good to excellent conditions. Drought trimmed the crop in South Dakota, but other areas fared pretty well. Conditions compared to previous to the last year, a little bit lower in Nebraska and Kansas, but much higher in Colorado. Sorghum is being harvested at a very quick pace. It's a drought tolerant crop, so it was planted in abundance this year, hence the big increase in acreage that I talked about just a few slides ago. Winter wheat, I do want to talk about last year's crop and then briefly this year's crop before I finish up. First of all, last year's crop, pretty much trend line nationally, but look at this difference as you move from south to north. We had record yields realized in the spring of 2021 in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky, but then we had decreases from last year of about 1/3 or more in the Dakotas and Montana. So dramatic contrast from east to west, south to north across the region in terms of how the 2021 harvested winter wheat crop turned out. Currently, we're seeing planting mostly complete in a lot of our areas. There have been some planting delays, however, in the east. Look at those lower numbers in Michigan and Ohio in particular. Also some spotty delays in planting due to dryness, especially in Montana. Meanwhile, emergence, a little bit slow. I think that'll pick up with the rains that we've been seeing in South Dakota and elsewhere. There are still some very dry pockets out there, so stay tuned to that to see how this crop becomes established this fall. And if you want to look at any of the latest statistics, we have our crops in drought that we publish on our website. And so currently we show about 41% of the winter wheat production area in drought. That doesn't include the northern plains, including Montana, still in a significant drought. And over the last year, we've seen the number 24% or higher, trending up in recent months as we've seen drought returning to some of our southern areas, including parts of Kansas and Colorado. Finally, rangeland and pasture conditions as we wind down the year, looking pretty good across some of the eastern areas. Looks like Wisconsin will wrap up with more than 2/3 of the pastures in good to excellent condition. Nationally, that number is just 25% though. That's because we're seeing continuing drought impacts, even where we've seen rain in the Dakotas, snow in Wyoming, rain in Wyoming. Still, it's going to take until next spring before we realize any recovery. It's just too late in the year, despite the warmer than normal weather. Days are too short, nights are too cool. We're just not going to get that sustained recovery. Grass will not regrow until at least spring of 2022. And so we end this year kind of similar to where we ended 2020, kind of stuck between where we were in 2011 and 2012 with pretty rough pasture conditions nationally. And so hopefully we'll continue to see recovery in some of those northern drought areas, but as of now, we still got some big issues related to pastures and rangeland conditions. And that brings us to my last slide, and that is the fact that there's a lot of economics at play here in the agricultural picture right now. Just overall, producers are seeing a 7.4% increase in overall prices paid for farm commodities, services, and other factors such as interest and taxes, wage rates. So that's one thing, but if you break it down and look at the feed prices, that's even a more dramatic increase from this time a year ago, 20% increase from August 2020. And in some areas, including North Dakota, we've seen increases much higher than that, more than doubling over the last year. And a lot of that is due to the drought. And then I talked about fertilizer in the opening. You can see that fertilizer prices up 29% from a year ago. This is based on August 2021 prices. And the situation seems to have gotten worse since then, both on prices and availability. So the whole supply chain's messed up right now. Fertilizer is one of the casualties, it does appear. And so with that, I'll stop. I think we're at an hour plus, and I'll turn it back over to Doug and or Dennis.
Thanks, Brad, and thanks, Laura, for your presentations. Let me get everything organized here just for a second. Okay, I see we have some other things that got stuck in here that I didn't see until right now. All right, let me start at the top. First, let me just say that Dennis Toddy has joined us as well, as he usually does in most months, as a contributor from USDA, based in Ames, Iowa Ag Hub, Climate Ag Hub there. So he's answering questions as well as both Brad and Laura will. So the questions for today, let's just see if we have. Yeah, so some of the earlier ones were. Did the Northern Plains drought have any tie-in to what happened in the Northwest earlier this year? And yeah, there was this quote-unquote heat dome that did settle over, obviously, the West Coast, where they got fantastically warm temperatures. And yes, in June, we realized a number of those, not so much, well, there were some records there, weren't there, Laura, in the Northern Plains in terms of temperatures, but not to the degree that we saw in the Northwestern U.S. That dome, if you will, I hate to say protected because that's the wrong word, but stopped a lot of precipitation or normal precipitation from happening, and thus the amplification of drought when they need their water in the Northern Plains and High Plains for that matter, and they didn't see it. Anything you want to say about that, Laura, or anyone else?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. It was exceptionally warm, especially that June time period, and also in the Dakotas and I believe eastern Montana, that May-June period comprises something like 30% of their annual precipitation. So that really dug the drought in deeper with that, stable, high pressure, hot temperatures out west and into the Northern Plains.
And I don't know how many folks in the audience, and I know there's some NOAA people on here, so they know, but if you go to weather.gov, you can see, this is in reference to the next question about frost and freeze, you can see where the next advisories and freeze warnings are coming. By the way, once those are issued and once they happen, you won't see them again until the next growing season. So once you're frozen out, once you reach 28 degrees or 32 degrees, actually, in some cases, the advisories are done for the year. There's nothing to advise anymore. Your tomatoes are dead. So anyway, you can go to weather.gov, not com, gov, and you can see where those advisories and freeze warnings for the next day or two are posted sometimes. Next question is about why, and this is really for Laura, why were West Nile virus numbers higher in the drought year than the wetter years previous?
Mm-hmm. So, so the species of mosquito that carry West Nile virus, their populations tend to peak in late summer, July and August. And what we think happens is they prefer warmer temperatures, and also they kind of congregate in those pools of water. So if you get a quick rain, even in a drought period, those puddles kind of concentrate the mosquito populations into areas. And so they kind of, instead of dispersing as much as they would like in a wetter year. So yeah, I think that's kind of it. We saw a quick peak in that species of mosquito in South Dakota when it got wet there in August, because they have about a 10-day, I believe, incubation period or growth period before they emerge. So it doesn't take long after a rain before they come out.
And a little bit about the deer, problems with deer, not only in South Dakota, but other places too, I've heard.
Yep, that's right. And that's also carried by a vector, by a midge that hangs around watering holes in wet areas again. And when it's droughty, the deer and other wildlife, pronghorn, elk, tend to congregate in those water areas and then get bitten by those midges that carry the disease. So that's why, again, we see increased incidence of that EHD in drought years, because they tend to congregate where the midges are that bite them.
And then a question for Brad and or Dennis in terms of wildfire smoke impacts this summer. You know, this summer, I don't know which was worse, this summer or last summer. It probably depends on where you live. But in terms of crop conditions, anything you want to say about that?
Brad, you want to take a shot, or you want me to go first?
I know you've talked about it before, Dennis. I don't know of any, direct impacts that I'm aware of for 2021 or 2020. Obviously, the upper atmospheric haze and smoke and dust does impact how much solar radiation makes it to the surface of the earth. But I don't think there's a tangible or measurable effect on crops in 2021, not that I'm aware of.
And there was some work out of Ohio State this summer that indicated that the solar radiation coming through the smoke is more diffuse and could therefore get into the crop canopy a little bit better, so the crop could use it a little bit better. The other side of reducing some of the solar radiation is we might have knocked a few degrees off the high temperature during some of these drought areas. That might have actually helped out the crops a little bit.
All right. Next question is sort of referring to La Nina a little bit in terms of, I think you might have said it, Laura, but you must have said it, Laura. But an example of a more coordinated atmosphere and ocean. And I'll just quickly say, I did write an answer in there. When we say coordinated, that means both the atmosphere and ocean are working in tandem or lined up or in parallel, or it's really what we expect to see for a La Nina evolution, the evolution of a La Nina taking effect. Certain clouds in the right place, certain trade winds blowing harder than they normally would in a different situation. So when we see, and then the oceans being cool where they should be, and then or cooler than normal, I should say, and then both those things linking together. And so what we saw this year, or so far this year, is a good linkage. Everything's behaving as it should in terms of what we would expect at the equator. Now, once we get away from the equator, I'm not going to say all bets are off, but it really depends more on what's going on in the northern hemisphere weather, and there's a bunch of other sort of chaos effects that can take that energy in different places. So Laura put up that graphic of arrows coming into North America. That's what we typically see with a La Nina in terms of wetter and cooler, sort of north and west, and drier and warmer to the south in terms of the lower 48. And we'll see actually as winter comes along, more along those lines. When do soils normally cool enough to allow for fall fertilizing? And boy, I've heard a lot of stuff about this, and this is not mine, so I'm going to let Dennis deal with this one.
Okay.
Or Laura, I'm sorry.
I mean, this is an additional effect of the warm temperatures, especially the warm overnight temperatures we've had this fall, as we've kept 4 to 6 inch soil temperatures much warmer than we would usually have. We don't have a good soil temperature climatology. The High Plains Regional Climate Center has created one for their region. We don't have one for the eastern part, the Midwest part of this, so we're working on that right now. So we don't have a typical time. And that's also been a side issue of people getting crops out early. Hey, I got my crops out. I got time to go ahead and put fall applications, but they unfortunately are making a bad choice and putting those on very warm temperatures because we're going to lose some of the nitrogen out of that, and it's going to end up in elsewhere where we don't want it to be. We probably have at least another couple weeks before we get down closer to where we need to be with lower sun angles and shorter days. That will help the soil temperatures cool, but we're still not dealing with widespread cold outbreaks or cold temperatures that would help cool the soils. So it's a be patient time, and hard to really say by how soon we would get to that 50-degree temperature we want it to be.
From what we know, our temperatures, and maybe Laura knows this too, in South Dakota, for example, are they 5 to 10 degrees above what they normally would be this time of year, or is that am I out to lunch?
Yeah, this is Laura. Again, we don't have good soil climatology like Dennis said, but I was just looking at the Mesonet data for South Dakota. Just this morning, just today, we're seeing 4-inch soil temperature below 50 degrees for the first time this fall, because our average daily temperatures are in the 30s. Today it's kind of cool. Yeah. So again, I don't know that's going to stick around longer than a few days, but we'll see. It does seem later though than average.
Okay.
And we need those soil temperatures to stay consistently below that, not just dip below it and then bounce back up. They need to go below and stable.
And there's nothing in the forecast that's really hinting that we're going to do that anytime soon. La Nina winter, are we setting up for another polar vortex like we saw last year, or just generally? And was 2018-19, that'd be 2 years ago. Is that right? Yeah, 2 years ago, or is that 3 years ago? Sorry. Is it like that year in a La Nina year and all that business? And so, it's hard. What I'll say quickly is that polar vortexes are in stratospheric warming, which I'm not going to talk about, but are linked often, is not something that's highly predictable more than a couple weeks out. I think that's what we usually would say about that. Any winter can have a polar or Arctic outbreak. Anyone, even an El Nino year, which tend to be actually fairly mild. But what we're doing with a La Nina year, I would say, is probably elevating the risk slightly for something like that, or maybe a lot, to happen more often. So a few more of those outbreaks could happen. Anybody want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think you're right, Doug, in that it's very difficult to predict those outbreaks more than a couple weeks in advance. And also, too, I don't know that, speaking of potentially colder temperatures in late winter, I don't think that's necessarily just driven by polar vortex. That's also driven by changes in the jet stream pattern. So, yeah, there's more than one cause, more than one way to get colder temperatures up here.
Yeah, and go ahead, Dennis.
I say the other part about that too is we can see these kind of events set up a little bit longer in advance about some pre to them, but we don't know where the cold off the pole is going to go. There was one event last year that there was one setting up, but it ended up going off to our east, or I think over Europe. So we didn't get the impact of it. So we can see that there's one setting up. We just don't know where the cold is going to go.
Right. And in fact, someone just mentioned on a call recently that there's one setting up now, but this is very early in the year for that even to happen. So we're not sure what's going on. There is also a tendency with La Ninas to have the cold and snow and wet or whatever later in the year. So we're talking January, February, March, or even April in terms of having a colder than normal or near normal in this case. And I'm really stressing the near normal because we're not used to near normal as much as we used to be in terms of cold. Sort of real winter realizing itself in February and March and that kind of thing. And there are some trends, especially in the northern plains, that sort of show that over the last 10 years to be the case. Okay, Durham farmers, Brad. in California plant in anticipation, did Durham farmers in California plant in anticipation of an awful Montana and North Dakota crop? Do you know? And then to follow up to that,
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't believe so, but I would have to check the acreage numbers too. I did not look at the state level acreage numbers to see if they planted more. I can get back to you on that.
And Brad, David Edick was the one who made that comment. If you want his email, I can send it to you.
Sure.
Any
reply.
comment or concern about wheat moisture in the Northwest? I know it's a little bit out of our area, but how about we just say from Montana to the coast?
Yeah, still huge concerns, I think, for eastern Washington, northeastern Oregon, eastward into Montana for lack of moisture for proper establishment.
Yep. And I have a quick note here from says comments on groundwater, and let's just say from anybody who wants to comment, any issues with groundwater that we've heard of. I'll say probably in the drought affected areas from Minnesota all the way, anywhere. Any issues?
I can comment on that just quickly. We see that the early response in shallow soils, and then that quick runoff into rivers and streams and surface water. Usually it's not unusual to see a delayed response in groundwater recovery, especially given the severe level of drought we've seen in the region. I don't know anything about the quality of water, but yeah, quantity, groundwater is often lagging behind the surface water.
And, there's again, it's very location specific. Northwest Iowa is a place where it's monitored because the aquifers are fairly shallow. It looks like, we get just enough rains at certain times to avoid problems there. I think there were some problems in northern Illinois, or close to problems in northern Illinois, because of the dryness there. It will probably be slow to recover in that area also. Those are the only two places I've heard of anything.
Any indications that dry conditions are amplifying, especially in the upper reaches of the Missouri River Basin? And what I'll say about that from a climate point of view is that upper reaches of the Missouri River Basin have seen the trend line for stream flow in that area is down. Whereas if you go further east, maybe, I don't know, not that far, the trend line for stream flow is increased over the last, I think it's 50 years or something like that. So we do see it's kind of two different areas and two different trend lines for stream flow or runoff. Precipitation is another question. So when you look at, I'm going to call normals for the last 30 years compared to, let's say, the last century, there is an increase in precipitation generally across the Midwest and Northern Plains. I know those two things don't necessarily jibe what I just said, but we're talking, it's actually two different things, stream flow and precipitation. So that can happen if you have higher evaporation or evapotranspiration, which of course, a year like this is a banner year for evapotranspiration, except when crops shut down, I suppose. Anybody want to comment on that at all? Sort of the climatology or changes that we've seen overall over time in the Northern Plains? I think that's where let's see. Yeah, upper reaches of the Missouri Basin. So,
do you want to jump on that, Laura?
Yeah, I don't have a comment on the climatology, but just look at the outlook that I presented today. Favoring wetter in the Northern Rockies for the winter season, and late winter favoring colder, so that could be good news to hang on to that snowpack a little longer into the spring season, which could mean more runoff, stream flow later. So as far as the outlook for this season, I think it's optimistic for upper Missouri Basin.
Okay, great, Laura, because I've had a comment on the climatology side. Doug was right about the Midwest and most of the Northern Plains, but the far western area of the Northern Plains, kind of that Wyoming, Montana, the trends are not as strong, and actually a little bit of drying has occurred in the climatology out there. So while other areas have been wetter, that far western part of the Northern Plains has been getting somewhat drier.
Yep, and someone asked about where they can go to get the winter outlook that was just released. And if you just go to noaa.gov, NOAA.gov, that's the big story of the day. It's NOAA, NOAA.gov. You'll see it. It's the first thing that pops up. Yeah. And then something about high natural gas prices impacting fertilizer production costs. Gas crisis in Europe closing some major fertilizer facilities. Europe prices will likely impact U.S. fertilizer supplies and prices. Yeah, this is Brad. Brad, you were mentioning supply issues and higher prices.
Yeah, and energy prices are obviously factoring into that too.
Yeah, yeah. The good. Hey, Dennis and Laura, let's mention the good news in terms of less energy going to do what this year?
Dry crops.
Yeah, because nature did it for them.
And actually, in some cases, people lost some yield because, especially soybeans, dried so quickly. There is a prime moisture percentage you want to have a crop at, where you don't get docked for the elevator having to dry it. But if you go below that, then you're actually selling less weight, so you lose a little bit in yield because of that. So it's an interesting situation, but that's a very common thing we saw across the whole region this year. Crops were drying very quickly, and people were jumping to try to get them out of the field as they were drying.
Hey, one thing that thanks, Bryce, for bringing this up. One thing that we did not talk about, and it's usually a little early for us to do this in October, but I know how in the agricultural business people are thinking ahead. So slow field work start in the eastern corn belt 2022, potential there because of La Niña and late season wetness. Go.
Yes.
Possible, especially east of the Mississippi.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a. Go ahead, Dennis.
I say, fortunately, soils are not really wet already, so that is an advantage. But we're not done with the fall yet. They tend not to freeze up like the northern plains, so any moisture in the winter enters the soil. Yeah, it's something to look out for going into next year.
It would be interesting to know if there's any statistics on that from a La Nina spring point of view in terms of late field work planting, whatever. I don't know if that stuff exists or not, that information. And the QPF, the precipitation for the next 7 days shows quite a swath of 3 to 4 inches from northern Missouri all the way to Ohio. So that's a big rainfall. Not to say that's going to be around next spring, but it's definitely a wet week. That is the final and last comment question that we have. I can't believe there's still over 100 people still on here, but thank you all for first of all, thanks to all the contributors, the two presenters, Laura and Brad, great as usual, and Dennis for answering questions about the region. So I just want to thank you all, and we'll see some of you back next month on the 18th, I think it is, and we'll have to figure out who the speaker is at that time, or before then, I suppose. Any other comments? All right, have a great day and a great weekend. Bye-bye.